Thank you so much, everyone. So today's panel, I'm pleased to introduce two fantastic speakers for today. The topic of the panel is understanding Pan Africanism within the digitalizing world and the 4IR. And obviously, this idea of innovation, the fourth industrial revolution, digital technologies, digital interventions, the fact that we are more interconnected now in the world than we've ever been at any point in history means that it provides many, many opportunities for Africans and people of African descent across the world to start innovating and changing our circumstances in different ways, but it also poses certain challenges. And with us today, my name is Ruhotsofetse Chikane. I am a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, and I'm so happy to be chairing this session. And with us, we've got two amazing speakers. We have Dr. Clifford Mane. He's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the National Research Foundation of South Africa, responsible for national research infrastructure platforms. This involves strategic oversight and leadership for research infrastructure provision across national research enterprises, central to which are the national research facilities. He has 30 years of professional experience and has been in management of research support and research capacity development programs at the NRF and at the South African Medical Research Council. We are so happy to have Dr. Clifford Mane with us, and we hope that he enlightens us today. We also have Dr. Getchi Karuru-Sabina. She's a scholar practitioner based in Johannesburg, working the intersection between people, place, and technological change. She's a visiting associate professor at the University of Witwatersrand School of Governance, where I'm also based, where she is coordinating the Civic Tech Innovation Network. She's also associated with the University of Cape Town's African Center of Cities, for Cities, and the South African Cities Network, and is a curator in the Emergence Network. Her current work is mostly around future of cities, innovation systems, and digital governance in Africa. Now, how this panel will work is that I'll let Dr. Karuru-Sabina go first, and then thereafter give Dr. Mane the opportunity to also present what he wants to speak about today. They both have about 10 minutes. And then thereafter, we're going to have a chat and a conversation. So feel free to put your comments in the chat box. Feel free to ask questions. I'll be monitoring the Q&A. We want this to be interactive as possible because we really want to get as many findings for this conference to allow us to put together a manifesto for Africans and people of African descent that really pushes us into the future. So Dr. Karuru-Sabina, if you don't mind, I would like to call for you to come up first.
Thank you, Ruhotsofetse, my homeboy from Wits. I appreciate the introduction, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody. I'm really delighted to be here today, and speaking about 4IR in that framing is not always my favorite thing, but it's always an opportunity to have a rich conversation, and particularly linked to a conference on Pan-Africanism. I'm really quite excited to be here. I'm going to share screen here. I was confessing to the organizers that I did something that's never quite always a good idea, which is to decide at the last minute to use a few slides when you hadn't decided that earlier. I hope you can see my slides. So the reason I did this, though, is because I have quite a wide range of rambling thoughts on the subject, and I thought it would be better to focus it on a few things. And so I open actually with this particular image from a film called Ifu Elimnyama by Russell Longwane, who does interesting work on experimental film, really beginning to ask questions about knowledge production. And he has this whole theory of transcendence and queering, if you want, language and retelling stories, bringing culture into a conversation about technology, almost creating new words, new languages, new myths linked to technological change. And perhaps as I go through my presentation, you'll see why I think this kind of queering, but also querying of technological change and what things like the 4IR mean, I think is extremely important for us, I think, in the context of Pan-Africanism. So I just leave you with that, and there's a link there if you want to have a look. So I actually grabbed this from a conversation I'd had with another group about race, which is not quite the same thing as what we're speaking on here. But they were asking me about the links between tech and race, and I said, well, so first of all, let's talk about what's the 4IR question. What's this technological thing that everybody speaks on? And in South Africa, I don't know about the other countries, but you hear the term the fourth industrial revolution just raised so many times and in so many ways, and half the time you're not quite sure what people are talking about, but the conversation is still carrying on. But it's really speaking to, and I've got another slide on this, but it's really speaking to a whole range of technologies around intelligence and automation. So you hear about, obviously, recently, mostly you hear people talking about AI, artificial intelligence. You hear people speaking about machine learning, big data, blockchain, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. Sensors, robotics, and all of these really are technologies that are disrupting and changing the way many normal things work. So the way work used to happen in many industries is changing. I have worked for a long time in the built environment. I'll actually be speaking to a bunch of quantity surveyors next week, and it's been extremely disruptive to construction as an industry because things are changing. And the big SOS that people then put out, because often they're warning signs when people ask you about tech and race or tech and Pan Africanism, but there are major issues around access and who has access and who doesn't. There are many issues around exclusion. There are concerns about surveillance, and everybody likes mentioning China and social credit systems and other ways government is using your data to surveil you, or corporates are doing the same. Discrimination. So people hear a lot about things like algorithmic bias and how people are building algorithms essentially that are racist or that profile people in particular ways. The privatization of our data and the exploitation of our information in ways we don't even understand. So there's so many of these. There's a whole litany of so-called digital threats, and many of them are quite real and quite true. But I like to say that in many ways, they're the same old story. And I'll come back to this because I don't discount them. Like I said, they are real, and they are real naughty things that anybody can do with the amazing capabilities of these technologies. But I would also like to say that people do that with many other technologies, even the simple kitchen knife.
Sorry, Dr. Kuru Sabina. We have, sorry to interrupt, we have 3 interpreters in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. If you could speak slightly slower, just so we... Yes.
Okay,
So
that's also the same
slower,
old story.
The same old story. Some things never change, regardless of the technology. Okay. Thanks so much.
I'll slow down. Thank you. Thank you, Josepete. I'll slow down. Sorry about that, interpreters. I appreciate your service. Good. So the point that I was making on this slide is that there are many digital threats, but any technology can be a threat, and I'll come back to this point. So I want to maybe make 3 big points about technology and the conversation we're having. So the 4th industrial revolution is real, and technology is changing things. But technology has always changed things. And so this slide just talks about, the previous revolution. So from the steam one to the industrial revolution to the, the ICT revolution to where we are now. And yes, there are obviously a much bigger range of technologies with much more fundamental implications for many business processes, many governance processes, many day-to-day activities. But the changes are bigger. The idea of change itself is not new. What is interesting, though, and that's this little slide on the right, is that there's this sort of 6 Ds that Diamandis uses in talking about how you can understand digital disruption, is that as things digitize, they go through these 6 stages. And in going through these changes, what's important is that they begin demonetizing, meaning becoming affordable to anybody, like the cell phone. And they begin creating the potential for democratizing. So they begin creating the potential for anybody and everybody to have access to that. So you'll hear, for example, that it's either a problem or an opportunity in tech today, is that anybody using their cell phone or even an internet cafe can develop an app. Now, that could be good because it means that anybody can participate in solving their own problems or creating economic opportunity for themselves or participating in a community initiative. But it also means, of course, as we've seen around the world, that anybody can also, start some ridiculous fake news thing or something extremely exploitative or something illegal. And so the democratization is something that means wider access, but whether it's for good or for bad, both are possible. Which comes to the next point. Technology is not racist. It's not anti-Africanist. It's not anti-South. People are. I picked out this article, and this really speaks to the same old story point that I was making, that according to this article, and there have been many about this as well, this is from the MIT review last year, it says that we've got to understand that things that perpetuate something or things that create a particular condition that appears to be discriminatory or negative, it doesn't mean that the thing itself is what produced the idea of racism or produced the idea of discrimination or produced the idea of exclusion. Those are the intentions of the people using the technology. Coming back to my comparison with a kitchen knife. So this is really important when I raise this, because often when people hear, for example, about algorithmic bias or about the surveillance state, the reaction often is to be anti-technology, is to say, okay, how do we stop the technology from doing this? How do we stop the development of the technology that is doing this? And in my view, that's a very disempowering stance to take. I think we have to tackle the issues, but we've also got to understand to what extent is the technology the crime, as opposed to the entities that are using it in those ways. Because as soon as you become what we call Luddite about technology, it means that you remove your own agency and your own opportunity to use the very same technology for different purpose. And I work with many people who use the technology for different purpose. So technology is not racist or biased in and of itself. The people who use it can be. The third point I want to make is that this is really about change in many different ways, but it's ultimately about the future. And so when we talk about 4IR and people's fears or hopes about it, ultimately it's what they are thinking about or hoping for projected forward. And in many ways, that space is already occupied. And when I say it's occupied, I mean it's occupied in our minds. And I take this quote from a paper that I was involved in. And it's really a paper in decolonial study, but it just makes this point that we've got to understand that what happens, what takes over our futures is not technology, but is when your imagination, when your own belief that you can think and do something different, when your own belief that you can change the order of things has been usurped, then therein lies the colonization. The tech is really just an instrument by which people can expedite that or augment that. But the real concern really needs to be how you are thinking about things and what's affecting your ability to imagine anything different. So this is the point I want to make here. We can have a much longer conversation about this one. And the fourth and last point in this series of points is that there's a relationship actually between technology and imagination as well. And I'm not necessarily saying technology is fantastical. Many of the things we hear and many of the fears sometimes are real. These are things technology can do. However, what's important is what's our capacity to imagine using the technology in different ways? What's the agenda? What is it you're trying to do? And that's an issue of imagination and the technology as a very powerful enabler. The technology that we can develop still, technologies that are yet to come, as tools, as instruments, as devices that we can use to do things. In some cases, things we couldn't have done before that were previously impossible, that are suddenly brought into the realm of possibility. But I'm a very big, avid proponent of remembering that imagination is very core to this. And I'll come to this point. I want to pause here just to say, so what can we do with what I've said so far? I'm suggesting that we can learn, and part of that learning is a reframe about what is it you're actually trying to do, and understanding there's bigger possibility. We can discover about the technology, but also discover about the agendas and the intentions we have, and we can experiment and try different things. We can be much more contextual about what are the domains in which technology is being deployed, and are those relevant to us? We can be imaginative, we can be bold. But we can also do. We ourselves can innovate. We can create technology. We can organize ourselves. We can network. We can leverage what's there. I'm not a big proponent of recreating, if AI is there, and in fact, it's still very much developing and evolving, use it. You don't have to be trying to create a new African technology. Use that one. But there may be other instances in which one does need to create brand new, and we should be able to do that as well. And we can action. I want to use this graph to speak to the point of imagination and creativity that I was raising before. And this is based on work that I've been involved with Riel Miller from UNESCO, who's the head futurist there, or the head of foresight. And what it speaks to, it's a bit complicated to speak to very quickly, but on the other hand, it's also very simple. On the x-axis here, it's asking, is this something that's been seen before? So is it a continuation of an existing trend or condition, or is it something new? And is it something where we can react because it's been done somewhere, we can learn from somewhere, or even we've done it before? Or is it something completely unprecedented? And what we use, or what I use this graph for, is to begin making this point that if you've done something before and it's been done by anybody before, then you're in the space of reform. Very often you'll hear big agencies like the World Bank, and you'll hear many big organizations talk about reform. I love reform, but I like reminding people that reform really works in contexts where you've seen it before and it's been done before. Great approach for that. Now, just to speed up a little bit, in these two other corners, where either you haven't seen it before or you haven't done it before, things become a little bit trickier, because either you're trying to retrofit to see whether your existing knowledge can apply to something, in fact, you haven't seen before, or you're trying to see whether you can deal with sort of old problems in new ways. So it's either old problems in new ways or old ways, new problems. And so those are also slightly different, quite different actually, from the idea of reform, because you are in a way already experimenting. The most important quadrant, and in a time of COVID, I think it's very relevant to think about this quadrant, is where we've not seen things before and we haven't done them before. So this is a space of needing to innovate. It's a space of novel change. It's the space of improv. And I would argue that many of the big crises we're seeing in the world today, and you can add technology if you want in that quadrant to some extent, are things that we haven't necessarily seen before, and things we've never necessarily solved before or really quite dealt with anyway. Now, that might seem like it's a big threat and a very strange space to be in, an anxiety-causing space. But in fact, what I like to remind people is that that's the space of invention. That's the space of novelty. And I like to say that for Africans, that's a space where we can really forget about the language of catch up and the language of leapfrogging from point A to point B, which are known. But that's the space where we can really come into ourselves. That's the space where we begin to understand that you need to be very careful that what is colonized is not your imagination, because imagination is what we need. We are not in the space of planning and contingency. We are not in the space of preparing for things we've seen or done before. We're in the space of real green opportunity, and we need to make sense of what that means. And the 4IR is an important space for that. I give here 3 examples. I know we're coming to time, Chair. I give here 3 examples of some of the kind of work that I'm sort of doing or playing with that relates to these ideas. Work around creating villages of technologies that are not just the technologies we are told about or that are on the shelf now. Technologies that solve the problems we have, and perhaps problems that others are not necessarily focused on, because these could be hyper local problems or hyper contextualized problems. And the solutions may not look like what people expect and therefore may not normally get attention. So that's some of what we're playing with in Bunja, in the Emergence Network. Action research networks are a very important space for thinking new things. And so the quote I shared earlier is from a project called The Capacity to Decolonize. And that's really about thinking about things quite differently and thinking about anticipation itself, how we think about the future differently. And the last one that was mentioned in the intro is the Civic Tech Innovation Network, that is very much about communities of purpose, about saying that civic actors can themselves develop technologies and push each other in different ways at a grassroots level. And it doesn't take, you know, the highest degree or the biggest institution or the greatest resource to do that. The democratization that I spoke of earlier allows us to do this. On this slide, I bring back the point of imagination to say the only way that I can imagine transformations happening, and the only way that I can imagine the African condition, if you want to call it like that, sort of moving forward, is through new imaginaries. And so this point of decolonizing the mind becomes so important. New processes that are much more inclusive, that are radically more inclusive, that begin to believe that everybody can participate, that participation is not the privilege of elite or universities or governments or corporations, but are something that everybody can do, and that we've got the tools to do that. And then to institutionalize. There's really no point of imagining new things and doing things in new ways if we don't make sure that they can stick, if we don't make sure that they become the way we do things. And so for me, a story about transformation and how we imagine different futures actually happening has to include these three elements. And so I end with this question about, so what does this mean for you in terms of what you could do? I think it's really very important in the academy. I think it's very important just in society in general that we begin to ask new questions and frame new research agendas that speak to a very different set of issues than what is often highlighted, I think, for us as being the issues we're trying to solve. I think we have to begin doing the kind of programming that responds to these new questions, that engages, that builds our literacy, even around things like technology, but beyond the technology, asking those difficult questions. I often dislike 4IR narratives that close down space by becoming so technical. And you'll hear in the way I speak, I really avoid using really flashy, fancy language. I'm a computer science major, I could do that. But what purpose would that serve if what we're trying to do is to do change together? So let's get literate, but also let's stop excluding people through the language we use. It's unnecessary. Let's also action things, let's innovate, and let's see how we can work communally and in spirals to really get things happening. And then finally, advocacy and being really clear, like I said earlier, that we're not shutting down space for ourselves by, for example, becoming sort of rabid activists against technology because it was used in a negative way, but really beginning to understand what's the battle we need to have and what are the windows we need to be using. And for me, I'm quite curious to hear from the conversation here what that means within a Pan-Africanist context. So I'm going to stop there, Chair. I hope this added some fuel to the debates that we are going to have. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no, thank you so much, Dr. Karuru Sabina. I'm very tempted just to say Getty, but I mean, that was fantastic. I mean, I have a ton of questions, but I'll save them, especially around, understanding what are the type of barriers that stop people from imagining, or that tension between wanting to reform. I really like that graph that you showed, that idea of reform versus discovery and creation, and whether those tensions exist, especially if you want to institutionalize these types of changes, because that's what we need on the continent, an institutional shift in mindset when it comes to digitalizing in the fourth IR. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Rumani in particular now to also offer his contribution to the conversation. I saw what he shared with me before, and I'm quite excited to hear more. So, Doctor, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Sorry, just give me a moment while I... apologies, I don't know where my presentation is gone now. Let me just check. Here we go.
Perfect.
All right, can you see it?
We can. You do have it on your PowerPoint presentation mode. So if you're using two screens, you might want to close that presentation preview on.
Okay, let me do that quickly.
So it
Usually
should
easy to do, but I don't know what's happening today.
Yeah, whenever I lecture, I also end up in the exact same situation. I think if you do press the exit button in the top right corner, I think that becomes an easy solution. And then we can see it this way as well, but if you want to make it full screen, and then the first time it showed perfectly. Perfect. Oh, we're back.
Is that showing full screen?
No, we're back on your.
To...
So if you click on display settings.
All right, let's see.
Yeah. I mean, we can also see it this way unless you want it to be full screen.
I might try that.
It is the challenge of dual screens. I understand it well.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
This should. All right. Excellent. Apologies
Perfect.
for that. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation, and I'm quite thankful that Dr. Karori Sibina introduced the whole topic that we're about today, because I'm a biologist, so it would have been dangerous for me to try and talk in depth about 4IR. But interestingly though, she picked up on a theme that I wanted to talk to this afternoon, of us looking as Africans and members of the African diaspora, of defining and taking control of things. So if we are talking about creating an equitable international order, for me, what it means, it's taking control, it's taking charge, it's taking charge of our own agency, and not so much what others expect us to do, but what we decide to do and how we decide to do. So the themes you spoke about of reframing, of being bold and imaginative, of innovating, of being able to leverage what already has been in order to effect our own action with regard to what we want to do. So this afternoon, I wanted to frame the conversation around how we take charge and map our own path and draw our own roadmap in terms of who we want to be as Africans and what we want to achieve and what sort of destiny. And also, I want to do this from the science and research context, where often we tend to respond when we're told to think about how we create this equitable order. We want to rely on other people to give us the space to do things. They are not letting us do this. They are creating these barriers to us doing this, to a situation where we are bold and we are audacious, and our imagination is not captured. Yes, we may be captured in other ways, but our imagination is always free. So I wanted to talk about the audacity dividend and utilizing what is known as the square kilometer array in the radio astronomy space. And this is the biggest radio telescope in the world. And when it's built in the next 10 years, it will they would have spent more than 2 billion euros building this scientific instrument. But what does it mean for a relatively small African country, like South Africa? And what is it? What did it mean with regard to the approach that we as a country adopted. And I want to focus on what sort of dividend derives from being bold and audacious and imaginative and innovative at your own pace and under your own determinations. So I want to have this quote that comes from the Africa Center for Economic Transformation that says, Africa will have to face these two major challenges. One is the climate crisis, and the other one is a technological revolution. And obviously for IR is an embodiment of the technological revolution. I want to add to that by saying that obviously you can see in the picture that's on the screen there that on the left obviously shows the climate crisis and its impact, particularly on Africa. But quite importantly, that picture shows the ones who carry the greatest burden of all the wrong decisions and wrong actions that we take as nations, often led by men. Women and children carry that brunt. And obviously on the right is a representation of, of an autonomous vehicle in an agricultural context, which is quite particularly relevant to the African context. And I believe that to respond to both will require audacity, it will require boldness, it will require resolve. And all of these, they have to transcend political ideology. And you'll see a little bit from what I'm going to talk about now. So the square kilometer array, it is and will be the biggest radio astronomy or radio telescope in the world, and South Africa in an African context will be hosting half of it, and the other half will be hosted by Australia. And what is quite particular for me here is about a comment that the chief technologist of the SKA precursor that we've built in South Africa, what he thinks about it, how he feels about it. And he says that this is one of the most advanced scientific instruments which has been built by Africans for the world, not even just for Africans. And it is built to the best available standards of performance and excellence. Okay. So what does the audacity lie? In 2003, South Africa submitted an expression of interest for hosting the SKA, as we call it, the Square Kilometer Array. At that time, the number of radio astronomers in this country could be counted in one hand, and there was no pipeline as to where the new astronomers or the new more radio astronomers were going to come from. It had no history of construction of major science infrastructure, especially of the scale, of the SKA. It had no history of constructing radio telescopes in particular. The one that was existing at that point in time at our RTBS Work Radio Astronomy Observatory had been constructed, by the Americans for different purposes, largely. And we had, as a country, had no real capacity at universities to train, radio astronomers or data scientists or electronic and mechanical engineers, as in terms of the numbers that would be required to make the SKA successful in this country. Fast forward a few years later, we now have what we call the Karoo Array Telescope, or CAT, or as it originally was. It's called Meerkat because it started out with seven dishes, and now we have 64 dishes that are dotted out in the Karoo near the town of Carnarvon. And I'm not going to go to the technical detail of what those dishes are, but all of these radio dishes, capture, signals and, from the universe in order to locate and to help us to understand the origins of the universe and how things have formed and evolved over time. But there were a number of dividends, and this is where I want to, to focus on. What have been the dividends of this audacious step that we took as a country, where we moved from nothing to something of the level of significance of the biggest, radio telescope, in the world. The first one is the kind of innovations that have come, computer innovations that have come to having right now, as we speak, what is the fastest computer, on the African continent and the 75th fastest, in the world, all assembled by Africans, in a little town, in a very dry part, of the country of South Africa. Two, the other, dividend is the case of the COVID-19, where as a country, we do not have a medical technology and biomedical engineering industry that manufactures, biomedical equipment. So Sarawa, which is our radio astronomy observatory that's going to be hosting, the SKA, was appointed by our Ministry of Trade and Industry to coordinate and project manage the design, manufacture, and delivery of 20,000 ventilators in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in order to assist in the pandemic response, of the country. And what they did is to use systems engineering techniques that they have learned from developing and constructing, the SKA precursor, to deliver high efficacy treatment systems in the form of CPAP ventilators, which are simple and straightforward and can be utilized even in under-resourced setups at a very low cost of equivalent of 750 euros, as opposed to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of euros for this kind of of biomedical equipment. The other one is that this audacious step and decision that we've taken to be part and to host the biggest radio telescope in the world is given rise to homegrown innovations and world-beating science. Example of one of those innovations is a data tube that's deployed at our South African National Space Agency, which can be utilized to develop data products for Earth observation. And obviously, Earth observation can range anything from monitoring the weather to even understanding illegal cultivation or the spotting of fires in areas that pose risk to society. Also, at first light, as they say, the first time that the telescope was switched on to do science, it produced the clearest image ever made of the center of the Milky Way galaxy, which is where we are located as humans, and our planet is. But the other dividend was that it also provided an opportunity to change the look of the scientific engineering and technical talent. So in these pictures that you see on the screen here, you have on the top left, students that are being trained in general radio astronomy techniques. On the right, you're having the postgraduate school at their annual conference. And these are mostly engineering students and master's and PhD level, radio astronomy and other related highly advanced, degrees. On the bottom left is an artisan training program, which is utilized to train people that will work on this global, scientific instrument. In the middle there, you have in the local schools, the introduction of digital technologies to assist in terms of teaching and learning in the science, maths, engineering, and technology, areas. And then the bottom corner is of a data science and big data program, that provides training to young people from all over the continent. And the other dividend is enabling a Pan-African approach to hosting this globally significant and the biggest radio telescope in the world, where when South Africa bid for the SKA, it bid on the basis of it being a project that will advance and assist and benefit not only us as a country, but other African countries. And as you can see on the left, there are various African partner countries who will not only benefit from association, but will also have infrastructure, as you see on the right, wherein a telecommunications dish was converted into a radio astronomy dish, which will allow Ghana to connect to the square kilometer array, their own telescope. And these other African countries will also, the plan is to benefit from what they call an African very long base interferometry, which is essentially having various instruments located at great distances being connected to function as a single instrument, to do science. So I think as Africans and people in the African diaspora, we want to redefine the terms upon which the world and the universe engages with us if we want to change and reframe and rephrase and reposition ourselves as equitable participants in the global scale. We have to be bold, we have to be audacious, we have to be resolute, we have to be unforgiving, and we have to be unapologetic about what we are capable of doing. And I've just listed here a number of advances in this area of 4IR that are already making a difference through innovations by Africans for Africans. In South Africa, the world's first middle ear transplant using 3D printed bones has been performed in the last couple of years. Drones are delivering medical supplies to rural communities in Rwanda. In Kenya, mobile money services giant M-Pesa is banking the unbanked, allowing millions to have access to financial systems. Biomedical smart jackets are helping doctors diagnose pneumonia faster in Uganda. In Nigeria, crowdsourcing is financially supporting thousands of farmers. In the educational space, already youngsters, from Cape Town to Cairo, are learning to code and to build robots that do meaningful things. Blockchain, one of the areas of advance in terms of 4IR, is decentralizing services in many sectors across Africa. So to go back to what Dr. Karore Sabina was saying, it is about these focal points that we have to embrace as Africans that will allow us to do this reframing and discovery and experimentation and contextualization and being bold and being imaginative and innovation, organizing ourselves, networking amongst ourselves, and leveraging that which we ourselves have done and other people have done in order to action and direct our future. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nkmani. And we are now, there have been a few questions that came in, I wanted to, but I'm going to take the prerogative as the chair to to ask the first one, and it's to both panelists, and either one of you could go first. You have both talked about the idea of being bold and being imaginative, and I remember watching a documentary around how Shenzhen, if I've got it correctly, in China, blew up over the last 30 years, right? And one of the aspects was the idea that children were learning how to code at a very young age. Children knew how to take apart phones at a very young age. When I say a young age, I'm talking about 8 to 10-year-olds who know how to take apart a phone, put it back together, and that helps build this industry of imagining, right? So, and imagining what you see in front of you, right? So if you've never seen a spaceship before, if you've never seen the inside of a cell phone before, right, it is hard to imagine something, whereas in other regions of the world, it's readily available, right? So they just have access to these resources that allow them to imagine. So the question then becomes, on a continent that has this dividend, right? How do we create that imagination of things that we can't see? So as Professor Karore Sabina was saying, how do we create a space where we can imagine the type of technologies, even though we don't have a lot of these available to us, if that makes sense? Dr. Mani, do you want to take that first and then Getchi?
Well, I think the essence of imagination is visualizing that which we have not seen. So, and that's the essence of who we are as Africans. We grew up making our own things, inventing our own games. And therefore, I think it's hardly a step forward that we need to make. All we need to do really is about focusing on not just encouraging that imagination rather than stifling it through, highly structured and compulsory and often outdated educational systems, but in creating the space for that imagination to flourish, and then putting in place the necessary mechanisms and ecosystems where that imagination can be translated into tangible use and application to benefit, as our societies at a local, even at a regional level. That would be my, off the top of my head, answer to that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, and I would certainly agree with that, that I think education, and not just the content of education, but the way we teach and how we position the role of learning. If it is going to be about very outdated rote learning, and this is about memorization and learning what used to be, as opposed to the idea that learning is really about expanding your capacity to learn. And that sounds like a sort of redundant thing to say, but I think it's a very important thing to say. I was part of the 4IR skills panel here in South Africa, and we had many of these conversations. And I suspect here is where, probably from a policy perspective, there are very tough choices that need to be made, because we're in a very difficult place where unemployment is so high that the knee-jerk reaction is to say, good, so let's focus just on training and skilling so that we can recreate jobs or re-attract jobs or and a lot of these things are chasing something that's moved. We're trying to, people like to talk about cheese that's moved. We're really not in a time where we ought to be trying to recreate or achieve modes of development that themselves are outdated. And maybe I can use this to also comment on a question I see in the chat from Pastor Chikane, and I really appreciate the question. I really do believe the 4IR is a vehicle that we can use, but I would like to reframe slightly to say that I think we can use it not to speed up, but to slow down. If slowing down means that we can choose the things to do that make sense and that don't destroy our future. A lot of the rest of the world fed into modes of development that have really gotten us into a lot of trouble. We've fed into nuclear futures, we've fed into colonizing space, we've fed into doing certain things where we are now trying to talk about this Anthropocene we've created, this destruction we've made where we are destroying biodiversity, we are facing climate change. We have created completely inequitable societies that are highly problematic, economies that are built on the back of all of that. That's not what we want to speed towards, but I think we can use the same technology to reframe that and do something different. We can create the futures we want to see and to have. And I love, I'll invoke the words of Mashalka, Professor Mashalka from India, when he talks about the goal is to do more for less, is to do more innovative things for many, many more people at a lower cost. So it's not about creating fancy things so that we can sell them and make money for the economy. That's old thinking in my view. I think there are very different things that we can do. And I love the point being made by Dr. Kamani here about as Africans, I think this is where our creativity, nobody had to write bars of music to tell us how to create the most beautiful music in the world.
Yeah.
We did it because it spoke to our spirits. I think when we think about the economy, we have to ask the same question, what speaks to our spirits? And 4IR can help us do it.
So if I was to come back to that, and so I fully understand, let me push the panelists a bit. So if we understand that there is the spirit and we should slow down to make sure that we don't make certain mistakes, to make sure that the changes that we create are effective changes and sustainable changes that we want, what are the areas we should be focusing on then, right? What are the areas that create tipping points for society when it comes to innovation, digitalization, the 4IR? What do you, in your opinion, what do you think are the particular areas we should be focusing on that you believe will create a tipping point of innovation? Dr. Caruso.
So I think, well, everybody always says education, obviously, hopefully relevant forms of education that, for example, begin to engage indigenous knowledge, that begin to encourage creativity and not just, sort of what we've been sort of trying to hammer, and expanding widely, vastly, the access to that education at all levels. That's something we have to do, I would say, in Africa. I would say the other thing is societally, we really need to begin rethinking value and what we are willing to value and pay for. And I mean pay with public money, I mean pay with private money. I think often we exclude people who in fact are probably adding great value to society through works they're doing. Like I mentioned, I work with a whole bunch of people in the civic tech space. Very difficult to find money in that space. And yet these are people who are developing solutions really for their communities. In many cases, perhaps areas of work that the state actually should be dealing with. And yet we don't see those forms of activity as work, and they have to struggle to maybe go for philanthropic funding, but we won't find as society ways to pay for that sort of thing. The other thing I would say, I like the point you are making, Rasofetse, about just the tinkering, in a way, the kind of engineering, expanding that sort of access where people can try and do things. I think there may be people in the audience who watched the movie The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind.
Yes.
And what I like about that story of a young boy in Malawi is he wasn't creating this thing because he had seen it before. He was creating this thing because he had a problem, first of all. He was determined to solve this problem, and he, struggled to then find the things that would make this thing possible. I think in that story, we can begin to see the pieces of where education can fit, but where also a focus on context becomes important, where the enabling environment. So I love to talk about the ecosystems. I like to talk about the innovation ecosystems. We have very disabling ecosystems in Africa, very disabling. And if we can't create those conditions for somebody to do something, then we're not going to learn.
I mean, you're completely correct. Creating those type of environments that allow that type of innovation is extremely important. But there's a question in the chat, and Dr. Vani, we're also running out of time. My chairing skills are clearly not up to scratch. But there's a question in the chat that speaks to this, and the question is around, and it's from Dr. Fulata Moyo, about what was the criteria for identifying which African countries would be part of the SKA process? Because, and I think it's important on two levels. One is, what is that criteria? But the second level is, what if the criteria is set up in such a way that doesn't allow that type of cooperation between countries? If you could answer that briefly, it would be much appreciated.
I don't believe that there was a set of criteria, but it was a case of engagement where our international relations and cooperation minister were in the context of the African Union. They opened up the opportunity to say we would want to bid for hosting this global science and research instrument. Are you interested? Are you able to participate? This is what it could take. These are the opportunities that it could create from a science, engineering, and technology and education point of view. So I think it's not so much as to that there was a set of criteria and then people were ticked or crossed against that criteria. It was a case of an engagement, and those countries that were able to come forward and commit in direct and meaningful ways and within the kind of timeframes that were being worked on, got on board. And as far as I know, it is not closed already. That there's still opportunity for for those countries, that are able to come forward and define a kind of sub agenda of theirs in the context of science, engineering, and technology.
I mean, that becomes deeply important, that idea of self-defining your agenda. And I think both speakers have touched on this in different ways. And just so both speakers know, I mean, the comments that we're taking from this particular breakaway session is all feeding back into an overall plenary document that we want to write, that will start us thinking about what are the types of steps we should be taking, what are the types of tipping point moments we should be looking for, what are the moments of innovation we should be also trying to harvest from citizens, and reminding people to imagine, and that you don't have to have seen something before in order to create something new. So that is our time. There's been a last little, Dr. Karu Sabina has just shared something in the chat. So if you have a little bit of time, because we're about to take a 15-minute break between sessions, this has been a really, really good session. We're going to ask you to take about 15 minutes, go grab a coffee, go get some water, do whatever you need to do. I don't know if it's enough time to make a whole lunch, but if you can, go off and do that, because we're going to have another panel at 4 o'clock. And I'm very excited for this panel. It is around how we understand the impact of climate change and economic change, both in the Pacific and on African migration patterns that we see, and how that links into this question of how do we become Pan-African in a world that's, honestly, when I get older, might be trying to kill me. So how do we stop that from happening? But also, how do we better understand what it actually means when climate change happens and it forces people to travel into the Mediterranean Sea, desperately looking for a better life? And the speakers for that panel are Jessica Breakey, Dr. Amira Woods, and Reverend James Bagwan as well. So the link for that chat is in the link for that panel rather is in that chat. And I just want to make one announcement before everyone desperately leaves. That link will also form part of our plenary session. So when you get into that link, we'll stay there for the rest of the day, but the chair of that session will tell you all you need to know. So the link is there. If you go back onto the website, find the auditorium tab, and you'll find that panel waiting for you. The room will open up at 4 p.m. Central African time. So when you find the chance and your belly is full and you're well hydrated, come join us for an amazing chat. Thank you so much to Dr. Karu Sabina, and thank you so much to Dr. Clifford Imani. You guys were fantastic, and I want to keep picking your brains for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Thanks.